The day I watched Karen Blackwell measure my front porch with a tape measure and a clipboard, I knew she'd picked the wrong architect to mess with. 27 years I'd been designing custom homes across Colorado, and now this self-appointed HOA enforcer thought my own porch violated some obscure covenant buried in fine print. What she didn't realize was that I'd just inherited 40 acres of pristine mountain land directly behind her precious McMansion, and I was about to give her a view she'd never forget. Let me start from the beginning, when life in Pine Ridge Meadows was actually peaceful. I'm David Sterling, and I'd built my dream home in this upscale subdivision 3 years ago, a custom craftsman with clean lines, natural stone, and a wraparound porch that perfectly captured the Colorado sunrise over the Front Range. Every morning, I'd sit out there with my coffee, watching the deer graze in the open meadow behind our neighborhood, breathing in that thin mountain air that smells like pine and possibility. The house had passed every inspection, met every building code, and fit perfectly with the neighborhood's rustic luxury aesthetic. My porch was generous, but tasteful 12 feet deep along the front, wrapping around to a side entrance where I'd installed a swing that my granddaughter Emma loved when she visited. Then the Blackwells moved in across the street. Karen Blackwell was the kind of woman who probably ironed her jeans. Everything about her was aggressively perfect, from her salon-styled auburn hair to her color-coordinated workout clothes to the way she power-walked through the neighborhood every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., checking everyone's properties like some kind of suburban patrol officer. Her husband, Richard, was a software executive who traveled constantly, leaving Karen with too much time and too much energy to focus on what she saw as the neighborhood's many imperfections. Within a month of moving in, she'd volunteered to join the HOA board. Within 2 months, she'd somehow maneuvered herself into the position of Architectural Review Committee chairwoman. That's when my problems started. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when I first saw her standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, holding a yellow legal pad and wearing the kind of frown that suggested someone had personally insulted her ancestors. The aspens were turning gold, and the morning air was crisp enough to make my breath visible as I stepped onto my porch with my coffee mug. "Mr. Sterling?" she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who's already decided you're in the wrong. "Could I have a word with you?" I walked down my front steps, noting how she was standing exactly on the property line between my yard and the sidewalk, close enough to make her point, not close enough to actually trespass. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Blackwell?" She consulted her legal pad with the theatrical precision of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this moment. "I'm conducting a neighborhood compliance review for the HOA, and I've noticed some potential issues with your property." "Issues?" She gestured toward my porch with her pen, wielding it like a weapon. "Your front porch appears to extend beyond the setback requirements outlined in our community covenants. Additionally, the side wrap-around section creates a visual obstruction that may violate our sightline provisions." I looked at my porch, the same porch that had been professionally designed, permitted, and approved by both the county and the original HOA board before Karen's arrival. "Mrs. Blackwell, my house was built 3 years ago. Every aspect was approved through proper channels, including HOA review." Her smile was as sharp as a paper cut. "Well, that's interesting, because I've been reviewing our architectural guidelines very carefully, and I think there may have been some oversights in the original approval process. Sometimes these things slip through the cracks." She pulled out a tape measure, an actual yellow Stanley tape measure, and began walking toward my porch. "What are you doing?" "Just confirming some measurements, for the record." I watched in disbelief as this woman began measuring my porch like she was conducting some kind of official investigation. The morning sun was climbing higher, warming the stone foundation and making her shadow stretch across my carefully maintained landscaping. The front extension is 14 feet, 4 inches, she announced, making notes. The side wraparound extends 12 feet, 6 inches from the main structure. And? She looked up from her notepad with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. And according to my interpretation of Section 7.3, 2 of our covenants, front porches may not extend more than 12 feet from the main structure, and side extensions are limited to 8 feet. My coffee was getting cold in my hand, but my blood was starting to boil. Those measurements weren't applied to my house when it was built. Like I said, sometimes things slip through the cracks. The good news is that we can fix this going forward. I'm sure we can work out a reasonable timeline for bringing your porch into compliance. Compliance? Well, you'll need to remove the excess square footage. Maybe turn it into a nice garden bed instead. I have some lovely landscaping ideas that would really complement the neighborhood aesthetic. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was hearing. This woman wanted me to tear down part of my custom-built porch because of her interpretation of some covenant language that apparently no one had cared about for 3 years. Mrs. Blackwell, I'm not removing any part of my porch. Her smile widened. Well, I hope we can work this out amicably, Mr. Sterling. It would be such a shame if we had to get attorneys involved. Legal disputes can be so expensive. As she walked back to her house, her tape measure swinging in her manicured hand, I should have realized this was just her opening salvo. What I didn't know was that she'd already scheduled a special HOA meeting to discuss my non-compliant structure with the full board. The official letter arrived 5 days later, delivered by certified mail, just as I was heading out to meet with clients. The return address read Pine Ridge Meadows, Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee, but the signature at the bottom was pure Karen Blackwell. I tore it open right there on my porch, the October wind trying to snatch the pages from my hands. The letter was 3 pages long, single-spaced, and written in the kind of legal-sounding language that was clearly designed to intimidate. Dear Mr. Sterling, it began, following a comprehensive architectural review of your property at 847 Elk Ridge Drive, the Architectural Review Committee has identified several violations of our community covenants. Several violations. Not just the porch anymore. According to Karen's letter, my crimes against neighborhood harmony now included an oversized front porch, non-compliant porch railings that were apparently 2 inches too high, exterior light fixtures that exceeded approved wattage limits, and this one made me laugh out loud, a front door that was painted in a color not specifically approved by the ARC. My front door was sage green. It had been sage green for 3 years. Half the houses in the neighborhood had sage green front doors. The letter concluded with a demand that I submit detailed remediation plans within 30 days or face enforcement action, including potential legal proceedings and daily fines. I was still standing there, reading the letter for the 3rd time, when my neighbor Janet Chen walked over from her house next door. Janet was a retired teacher in her 60s, the kind of woman who brought you soup when you were sick and remembered your birthday every year. David, you look like someone just told you the world was ending. I handed her the letter. Karen Blackwell has apparently decided my house is a threat to Western civilization. Janet read through it, her expression growing more incredulous with each paragraph. This is insane. Your house is beautiful, and it fits perfectly with the neighborhood character. Tell that to our new Architectural Review Committee chairwoman. Janet folded the letter and handed it back to me. You know, there's something you should know about Karen. My friend Margaret lives in Aspen Creek Estates, where the Blackwells used to live before they moved here. According to Margaret, Karen pulled the same kind of stunts over there. She got herself onto their HOA board and started targeting people whose houses she didn't like. What happened? They finally voted her off the board after she tried to force a family to remove their children's swing set because it was aesthetically inconsistent with neighborhood standards. But not before she'd cost several families thousands of dollars in legal fees and forced modifications. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. So this is her pattern? Seems like it. The woman gets her kicks from controlling other people's properties. Power trip disguised as community service. That afternoon, I did something I probably should have done the day Karen first appeared with her tape measure. I pulled out the original architectural plans for my house, all 67 pages of them, along with every approval letter, every permit, and every piece of documentation from the original build process. Everything was in perfect order. My porch dimensions had been clearly marked on the submitted plans. The HOA board at the time, 3 different people who'd since moved away, had signed off on everything. The county had issued permits based on those same measurements. Every single aspect of Karen's complaint had been previously reviewed and approved by the proper authorities. But as I spread the documents across my dining room table, I realized I was fighting more than just a property dispute. Karen Blackwell had turned my home into a target in some kind of personal crusade, and she clearly had no intention of backing down just because she was wrong. I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. What I didn't know was that while I was reviewing my architectural plans, Karen was already preparing her next attack, one that would involve the entire HOA board and a very expensive structural engineer. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night in November, and according to the notice taped to my front door, my porch was the only item on the agenda. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely sick. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a briefcase full of documentation and found Karen already there, setting up what looked like a professional presentation. She had brought poster boards, actual foam core poster boards covered with photographs, measurements, and what appeared to be legal citations. She'd also brought a projector and a laptop, because apparently my porch required a multimedia presentation to properly condemn. "David," she said when she saw me, her voice dripping with fake friendliness. "So glad you could make it. I think you'll find tonight's discussion very illuminating." The 5 other board members filtered in over the next few minutes. I knew them all by sight: Jim Patterson, a retired accountant; Sandra Wells, a real estate agent; Mike Rodriguez, who worked in tech; Lisa Thompson, a nurse; and Bob Hartley, a contractor who'd actually complimented my house when I first moved in. Karen called the meeting to order with the kind of formality usually reserved for Supreme Court proceedings. "Tonight, we're here to discuss the ongoing architectural compliance issues at 847 Elk Ridge Drive," she began, clicking her first slide into view. It was a photograph of my house taken from across the street, with red arrows pointing at my porch like it was a crime scene. "As you can see, the structure in question significantly exceeds our community standards for front porch dimensions." She clicked to the next slide, a close-up photo of my porch with measurements overlaid in red text. The front extension measures 14 feet, 4 inches, which exceeds our covenant limits by over 2 feet. Bob Hartley raised his hand. "Karen, what exactly are the covenant limits? I don't remember any specific measurements in the original documents." Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, Bob, that's where things get interesting. I've been working with our HOA attorney to clarify some ambiguous language in Section 7.3.2. She clicked to a slide showing a blown-up section of text from the covenants. The language states that porches should be appropriately proportioned to the main structure and consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Our attorney's interpretation is that this implies a maximum extension of 12 feet for front porches. I stood up. That's not what it says, and that's not how it was interpreted when my house was built. Karen's voice got sharper. "David, you'll have your chance to speak. But first, I want the board to understand the full scope of the problem. She clicked through several more slides, each one more ridiculous than the last. She'd apparently spent weeks photographing every house in the neighborhood, creating a database of porch measurements and architectural features. According to her presentation, my porch was not only oversized, but architecturally aggressive and inconsistent with community harmony. Furthermore, she continued, I've hired a structural engineer to assess the potential impact of this oversized structure on neighborhood property values. She clicked to a slide showing a formal report with an official letterhead. According to Henderson Engineering Associates, oversized front porches can negatively impact adjacent property values by up to 15%. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I could see the other board members exchanging glances, clearly trying to process what they were hearing. 15%? Sandra Wells asked. That seems high. Property values are delicate things, Karen replied smoothly. When one house in a neighborhood fails to maintain architectural consistency, it affects everyone. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. This is completely fabricated. Karen turned to face me, her expression ice cold. I'm sorry. I pulled out my briefcase and started spreading documents on the table in front of me. Every measurement, every dimension, every architectural detail of my house was approved by the original HOA board 3 years ago. I have the signed approval letters right here. David, Karen said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, those approvals were issued under different leadership, with different standards. The board has evolved. The covenants haven't evolved. They're the same document we all signed when we bought our houses. Karen clicked to her next slide, a photograph of several other houses in the neighborhood, all with smaller porches than mine. As you can see, David's structure is clearly an outlier. It doesn't fit with the established neighborhood character. Bob Hartley leaned forward. Karen, I built half these houses, including David's. Every one of them met the same standards and went through the same approval process. And maybe that's part of the problem, Bob. Maybe we need to be more careful about what we approve going forward. The room fell silent. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. The smell of burnt coffee from the clubhouse kitchen was making the stale air even more oppressive. Lisa Thompson, the nurse, spoke up quietly. Karen, I have to ask, why are we focusing on David's house specifically? There are several houses in the neighborhood with large porches. Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and vindictive underneath. Lisa, we have to start somewhere. David's property represents the most egregious violation of our standards. But his house was professionally designed and approved through proper channels, Mike Rodriguez added. This feels like we're changing the rules after the game has already been played. Karen was losing the room, and she knew it. I could see the desperation creeping into her expression as she realized her multimedia presentation wasn't having the impact she'd expected. Look, she said, her voice getting sharper, the bottom line is simple. We have community standards for a reason. If we let one person ignore those standards, where does it end? Do we let people build whatever they want? Do we just abandon any pretense of architectural control? She clicked to her final slide, a photo of my house with the word DACISION overlaid in large red text. I'm asking this board to issue a formal violation notice requiring Mr. Sterling to bring his porch into compliance with our community standards within 60 days. If he refuses, we initiate legal proceedings. The room was dead quiet for a long moment. Finally, Jim Patterson, the retired accountant, cleared his throat. I need to see those original approval documents, he said. As the meeting dragged on past 10 o'clock, with board members poring over my architectural plans and Karen's engineering reports, I realized this was no longer just about a porch. This was about power, control, and one woman's determination to reshape the neighborhood according to her personal vision. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already filed a formal complaint with the county building department, claiming my porch had been built without proper permits. By morning, I'd be dealing with more than just HOA politics. The county inspector showed up at my door at 7:30 a.m. on a Friday, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Through my kitchen window, I could see Karen Blackwell standing on the sidewalk across the street, wearing a bright red jacket and holding a thermos, clearly positioned to watch the show she'd orchestrated. "Mr. Sterling? I'm Bill Crawford from the county building department. We've received a complaint about potential permit violations on your property." I invited him in, my heart sinking as I realized how far Karen was willing to escalate this dispute. Bill was a weathered man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of construction, scam, and building code violation imaginable. "What kind of complaint?" "Someone called our office, claiming your front porch was built without proper permits and doesn't meet current building codes." He consulted his clipboard. The complaint specifically mentions structural concerns and setback violations. I led him to my home office, where I had organized all my construction documents after the HOA meeting. "Here's every permit that was issued for this house, including the porch construction." Bill spent 20 minutes reviewing the paperwork, occasionally grunting or nodding as he cross-referenced permit numbers with his own records. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Sterling, all your permits are in order. Everything was properly approved and inspected during construction. I don't see any violations here." Relief flooded through me. "So this complaint is baseless?" "Well, I still need to do a physical inspection to close out the complaint file. But based on these documents, I don't expect to find any problems." We spent the next hour walking around my house, while Bill measured, photographed, and checked various structural elements. He was particularly thorough with the porch, testing railings, checking foundation connections, and verifying that everything matched the approved plans. "Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand building codes or has some kind of personal agenda," he said finally. "This is solid construction, properly permitted, and fully compliant with all relevant codes." As Bill packed up his equipment, I noticed Karen was still standing across the street, now joined by two other neighbors who seemed to be engaged in animated conversation. "Mr. Sterling," Bill said as he prepared to leave, "I have to ask, do you know who filed this complaint?" I glanced across the street at Karen, who was now staring directly at us. "I have a pretty good idea. Well, whoever it was, they wasted everybody's time. I'll file my report stating that no violations were found. But I'll warn you, false complaints can sometimes be a harassment tactic. If this happens again, you might want to consider documenting it." After Bill left, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching Karen finally retreat to her house. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant smoke from someone's fireplace. My porch, the same porch that had been the center of so much controversy, felt more like home than ever. But my moment of victory was short-lived. Around noon, my doorbell rang, and I found a different kind of official visitor waiting outside. "Mr. Sterling? I am Jennifer Walsh from Morrison, Hayes and Associates. I represent the Pine Ridge Meadows, HOA." She was young, probably fresh out of law school, with the kind of expensive briefcase and nervous energy that suggested she was being paid by the hour to handle something she didn't fully understand. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Walsh?" "I'm here to serve you with formal notice of an HOA covenant violation and to discuss potential resolution options." She handed me a thick envelope with my name, typed on expensive-looking letterhead. Inside was a 10-page legal document that basically repeated everything Karen had said at the board meeting, but wrapped in enough legalese to make it sound official. The HOA board has voted to find your property in violation of community architectural standards, she continued, reading from what was obviously a prepared script. You have 30 days to submit a remediation plan, after which the association will begin assessing daily fines of $250. $250 a day. That was over $90,000 a year, enough to force most people into compliance, regardless of whether they were actually in violation of anything. Mrs. Walsh, the county just inspected my property this morning and found no violations whatsoever. She looked genuinely surprised. The county inspected your property? Someone filed a false complaint, claiming my porch was built without permits. The inspector spent 2 hours here and concluded that everything is properly permitted and fully compliant with building codes. I could see her confidence wavering. This was clearly not part of the script Karen had provided. Well, she said finally, county building codes and HOA covenants are two different things. The association has the right to maintain architectural standards that go beyond basic building requirements, even when those standards are being selectively enforced, even when they're being applied retroactively to houses that were previously approved. She consulted her legal pad, clearly out of her depth. Mr. Sterling, I'm just here to serve the formal notice and explain your options. If you want to dispute the violation, you can request a hearing before the full HOA board. And who chairs that hearing? The Architectural Review Committee chairwoman, Mrs. Blackwell. I almost laughed. Karen had created a perfect system. She could accuse anyone of violations, force them into expensive legal proceedings, and then judge their appeals herself. As the young attorney left, I realized that Karen had just made a critical tactical error. By escalating to legal threats and daily fines, she'd crossed the line from neighborhood dispute into something that could have serious financial consequences. She'd also demonstrated a pattern of harassment that was becoming impossible to ignore. But more importantly, she'd reminded me of something I'd forgotten in all the drama of the past few months. 3 years ago, when I was shopping for land to build my dream house, I'd actually looked at 2 properties in Pine Ridge Meadows. I'd chosen the smaller lot on Elk Ridge Drive because it was more affordable and better suited to the house design I had in mind. The other property, 40 acres of pristine mountain land directly behind the neighborhood, was still for sale. And thanks to a recent inheritance from my uncle's estate, I suddenly had the resources to buy it. What Karen didn't know was that while she was busy trying to tear down my porch, I was about to build something much bigger, something that would give me a perfect view of her house and her a permanent reminder of what happens when you pick fights with the wrong architect. The real estate closing took place on a Tuesday morning in December in the sterile conference room of a title company office that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. I signed document after document, transferring ownership of 40 acres of mountain wilderness directly behind Pine Ridge Meadows from the Hartwell Family Trust to myself. Karen Blackwell had no idea what was happening 2 miles away, as she was probably at home planning her next assault on my property values. The land was spectacular rolling meadows that climbed toward stands of aspen and pine, with a natural plateau about 300 feet above the subdivision that offered commanding views of the entire valley. More importantly, it offered a perfect view directly down into Karen's backyard. I'd been hiking the property for weeks, ever since the idea first occurred to me, working with a surveyor to identify the optimal building site. The plateau was ideal, high enough to be dramatic, stable enough for construction, and positioned so that any structure built there would be visible from every house in Pine Ridge Meadows. The same day I closed on the land, I filed preliminary plans with the county for a residential mountain lodge. The structure I had in mind was ambitious, a 6,000 square foot log home with a tower that extended another 30 feet above the main roofline. The tower would house my home office and drafting studio with floor-to-ceiling windows on all sides. From Karen's backyard, it would look like a castle overlooking her kingdom. The county planning department loved it. The design fit perfectly with Colorado's mountain architecture traditions. The environmental impact was minimal, and the location was far enough from any neighbors to avoid noise or privacy concerns. Well, almost far enough. Pine Ridge Meadows was technically within the required setback distance, but the elevation difference meant my lodge would be looking down rather than across at the subdivision. I submitted my plans on a Wednesday and received preliminary approval the following Monday, a speed that probably reflected the county's appreciation for dealing with an architect who actually knew how to prepare proper documentation. But I wasn't quite ready to break ground yet. First, I wanted to handle the little matter of Karen's harassment campaign. The Pine Ridge Meadows board meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of December, and according to the agenda I'd received, my ongoing architectural violation was once again the primary topic of discussion. Karen had apparently convinced the board to schedule a formal violation hearing, where I would be given 15 minutes to present my defense before they voted on whether to begin daily fines. I arrived at the meeting carrying a large portfolio and wearing my best suit, the same navy wool I wore to important client presentations. If Karen wanted to treat this like a formal legal proceeding, I was happy to oblige. The community clubhouse was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the Porch controversy, and it seemed like half the residents had shown up to watch the show. I recognized faces from throughout Pine Ridge Meadows, some supportive, some curious, others clearly aligned with Karen's faction. Karen sat at the front table with the other board members, wearing what I can only describe as power armor, a sharp black blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, paired with the kind of jewelry that was designed to intimidate rather than accessorize. "Before we begin tonight's proceedings," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this moment, "I want everyone to understand what we're dealing with here. This isn't just about one oversized porch. This is about maintaining the standards that protect all of our property values." She gestured toward a new set of poster boards she'd prepared for tonight's presentation. "I've spent the past month researching comparable home values in neighborhoods with and without strict architectural enforcement. The data is clear: communities that fail to maintain consistent standards see significant depreciation in property values." I had to admit she'd done her homework. The presentation was professional, comprehensive, and completely irrelevant to the actual issue at hand. "Mr. Sterling," she continued, turning to face me with the expression of a prosecutor addressing a particularly distasteful defendant, "you've had 3 months to work with us on a reasonable solution to your compliance issues. Instead, you've chosen to waste county resources with frivolous inspector visits and ignore our good faith efforts to resolve this matter amicably." It was a masterful performance, painting me as the unreasonable party while positioning herself as the long-suffering community advocate. If I hadn't known better, I might have been impressed by her audacity. "You have 15 minutes to present your case," she said, consulting an actual stopwatch she'd placed on the table. "Then we'll vote on whether to proceed with enforcement action." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, setting my portfolio on the table and pulling out the first set of documents. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns." I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. These were my neighbors, people I'd waved to for 3 years, people whose children Emma played with when she visited. 3 years ago, I moved to Pine Ridge Meadows because I fell in love with this community. The natural beauty, the architectural diversity, the sense of space and freedom that comes with mountain living. I spent months working with architects and designers to create a home that would fit perfectly with the neighborhood's character. I pulled out the original approval documents and held them up so everyone could see them. Every aspect of my house, including my porch, was reviewed and approved by the HOA board that existed at the time. Every permit was properly obtained. Every inspection was passed. Everything was done by the book. Karen started to interrupt, but I kept talking. But tonight isn't really about my porch, is it? Tonight is about power, about one person's vision of what this neighborhood should look like, regardless of what was agreed to when we all bought our houses. I pulled out the county inspector's report and read directly from Bill Crawford's conclusion: no violations found. Structure is properly permitted and fully compliant with all applicable codes. The county has confirmed that my house meets every legal requirement. So we're not talking about safety issues or building code violations. We're talking about someone's personal aesthetic preferences being imposed retroactively on their neighbors. The room was completely silent. I could see Karen's face getting redder with each sentence. But here's what really concerns me about this situation, I continued, pulling out my final set of documents. This pattern of selective enforcement, of targeting individual homeowners with expensive legal proceedings, of changing the rules after houses are already built. This isn't community leadership. This is harassment. I looked directly at Karen. And harassment has consequences. I opened my portfolio to reveal the architectural drawings for my mountain lodge detailed renderings that showed exactly how it would look from every angle, including the view from Pine Ridge Meadows. While Mrs. Blackwell has been focused on my 12-foot porch, I've been focused on a slightly larger project. I've just purchased 40 acres of mountain property directly behind our neighborhood, and I've received county approval to build a 6,000 square foot mountain lodge with a 30-foot observation tower. I held up the first rendering of view of the lodge as seen from Pine Ridge Meadows, showing how it would dominate the skyline above the subdivision. The lodge will be perfectly legal, properly permitted, and fully compliant with all applicable building codes. It will also be visible from every house in Pine Ridge Meadows, including a particularly nice view from the Blackwell residence. Karen's face had gone from red to white. She was staring at the architectural drawings like they were radioactive. Construction begins in the spring, I announced. I estimate it will take about 18 months to complete. During that time, there will be construction noise, dust, and heavy equipment traffic on the mountain roads above your neighborhood. All perfectly legal, all properly permitted. I folded up the drawings and looked around the room one more time. Now, Mrs. Blackwell, would you like to discuss reasonable solutions to our mutual concerns? Or would you prefer to continue this enforcement action against my perfectly legal, properly approved, county-inspected porch? The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Karen sat frozen at the front table, staring at my architectural drawings like they were a death sentence. The other board members were looking back and forth between us, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Bob Hartley cleared his throat. "David, are you serious about this lodge?" I pulled out the signed purchase agreement and the county's preliminary approval letter. "Dead serious, Bob. I break ground in April." Sandra Wells leaned forward. "And it's really going to be visible from the entire neighborhood?" "Especially from Elk Ridge Drive," I confirmed, looking directly at Karen. "The Blackwell house has what you might call a premium view of the construction site." Karen found her voice at last, though it came out as more of a croak. You can't do this." "Actually, I can. Unlike certain HOA enforcement actions, my lodge will be built on my own property, with proper permits, and in full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations." Jim Patterson, the retired accountant, was studying the architectural drawings with obvious appreciation. "This is actually a beautiful design, David. Very respectful of the natural environment." "Thank you, Jim. I tried to create something that would complement the mountain landscape while providing commanding views of the valley below." Karen was looking around the room desperately, as if someone might rescue her from the trap she'd built for herself. This is retaliation. This is harassment. No, Mrs. Blackwell, this is architecture. This is what happens when you commission a custom mountain lodge from someone who's been designing them for 27 years. Mike Rodriguez was grinning now. So let me get this straight. You're building a castle on the mountain behind our neighborhood, and Karen's going to have a front row seat to watch it happen? Well, more of a lodge than a castle? But yes, the observation tower will be quite prominent from most backyards in Pine Ridge Meadows. Lisa Thompson, the nurse, spoke up quietly. David, how long did you say construction would take? 18 months, assuming normal weather patterns. Of course, mountain construction can be unpredictable. If we hit delays due to weather or permit issues, it could stretch into 2 years. I let that sink in for a moment. 2 years of construction noise and activity looming over Karen's backyard. But here's the thing, I continued, adopting the same reasonable tone Karen had used when she first demanded I modify my porch. I'm a reasonable person. I'm open to discussing alternatives that might benefit everyone. Karen's eyes narrowed. What kind of alternatives? Well, for instance, if this board were to vote to dismiss all architectural violations against my property, recognizing that my porch was properly approved and is fully compliant with both county codes and the original HOA covenants, I might consider scaling back the lodge design. The room was holding its collective breath. How much scaling back? Bob Hartley asked. I made a show of consulting my drawings. I could probably reduce the main structure to about 4,000 square feet. Maybe eliminate the observation tower entirely. Build something more modest, less visible from the neighborhood. Karen was calculating frantically, her mind clearly racing through the implications. A 4,000 square foot lodge without a tower would still be visible from her backyard, but it wouldn't dominate the skyline like my current design. And if the board were to dismiss the violations, she asked carefully, then I'd submit revised plans to the county within 30 days. Something more neighbors.